Relax and listen to the voice. From Cadiz, Spain. There is a house in the old part of the Spanish city of Cadiz that is known as La Casa de los Espejos, or the House of Mirrors. It is an imposing and elegant three-story house with architecture that evokes its Spanish past. The innocent facade fools no one because anybody in Cadiz who believes in ghosts and knows the mansion's history always steers well clear of the place at night. Legend has it that years ago, an important admiral in the Spanish Navy lived in the house with his wife and young daughter. The admiral's job meant that he was often away from home for long periods of time as his ship traveled from port to port. His journeys took him to many different and exotic foreign countries. They say that the admiral loved and cherished his beautiful daughter more than life itself. Whenever he left, his daughter would wave goodbye with tears streaming down her cheeks. She missed him more than anything else in the world. His daughter collected mirrors, and so, as a token of his deep affection for her, each time he returned from one of his trips, he would bring her back a new mirror as a present. As the years passed, the house became filled with more and more ornate and exquisite mirrors. The girl enjoyed walking around her home and being able to gaze at her own reflection in each mirror. Her father often boasted to his friends and colleagues that his daughter was the most beautiful girl in Cadiz. Over the years, the admiral's wife had grown old and lost her looks. She hated having to see herself in the mirrors and became very jealous of her beautiful daughter. Gradually, the woman sank into the depths of depression, and her resentment towards her own daughter increased in its intensity. The arguments and fights between mother and daughter became more and more frequent during the periods in which the admiral was away at sea. The mother-daughter relationship was irretrievably contaminated by the secret hatred that grew in the mother's spiteful heart. She became convinced that her husband loved their daughter more than he did his own wife. Blinded by jealousy, her thoughts grew dark and vengeful. On the day that the admiral left on his final trip, his wife took the opportunity to put an awful plan into action. She gave her daughter a poisoned drink, and the poor girl drank the poison and suffered for days, bleeding from the mouth and the eyes, before she finally slipped into a coma and eventually died. The mother was convinced that with the daughter out of the way, she and her husband could rekindle their love. The admiral returned a week later and was met at the front door by his wife. She calmly informed him that their daughter had contracted a horrible disease and had died while he was away. Upon hearing the terrible news, the man burst into tears. He was completely devastated and spent the next few days sitting in his daughter's bedroom with his head in his hands, weeping bitterly. Late one night, as the father was wiping the tears from his eyes, he happened to glance into one of the mirrors that hung on the bedroom wall. What he saw there made him tremble with fear. In the mirror stood the ghostly figure of his beloved child, and as he watched, a shocking scene unfolded in the mirror. It seemed that his daughter was sending him a message from beyond the grave. Reflected in the mirror, he saw his wife poisoning a drink and offering it to his daughter. He watched as his daughter lay in bed, blood pouring from her eyes and mouth, screaming out in pain. At her bedside, his wife sat and silently gloated. The sight of his beloved child thrashing about in agony before finally succumbing to the deadly poison was more than the poor man could handle. Stunned and full of anger after having discovered the awful truth, the admiral ran downstairs and grabbed his wife by the arms. He forced her to confess to the crime and then marched her down to the local police station and turned her in. The woman was put on trial for the murder of her daughter and sentenced to spend the rest of her days alone behind the bars of a filthy prison cell. However, the father never recovered from the death of his only daughter. He simply could not bear to go on living in the house where she had been so cruelly murdered. Each mirror reminded him of his daughter's beauty, and he was unable to get over the pain of her loss. He left Cadiz and moved far away in an effort to forget his past. The house lay abandoned for decades, its walls still covered with mirrors. People who lived nearby claimed that, late at night, they could hear screams echoing around the building, and they said it sounded like a young girl crying out in pain. Some brave souls ventured into the house to investigate the mysterious sounds. The noises seemed to be coming from the top floor. They said that they could hear the pitiful weeping and wailing of a child splitting the silence of the night. The screams seemed so strange that they seemed to bounce off of the mirrors as if the sounds were emanating from each individual mirror. One curious and careless individual accidentally broke one of the mirrors. They say that when he picked up the fragments and looked at them, they did not reflect his face, but instead, reflected in the mirror, he was horrified to see the dead girl. Her face bore an expression of anger that sent a chill down his spine and made him run, screaming, from the house. Others who have visited the house claim that they caught a glimpse out of the corner of their eye of a girl watching them from inside the mirrors. Upon seeing this, some fled the house in terror, counting themselves lucky to have escaped with their lives. As the years passed, the history of the House of Mirrors and what had happened there began to spread from Cadiz to the rest of Mexico. The legend became so famous that many teenagers came from far and wide to explore the old, dilapidated building at night. Most of them wanted to either demonstrate their courage or investigate whether it was possible to look in the mirrors and catch a fleeting glimpse of the murdered girl. A few years back, some young people began organizing trips to the old place. They held a contest to see who would dare stay the longest inside the haunted mansion. They say that once you spend a few minutes inside the House of Mirrors, you won't dare to enter for a second time. From Indiana, United States of America. Years ago, on Blue River in Indiana, in the United States of America, a girl was accidentally decapitated while out canoeing. Allegedly, the ghost of the girl can still be seen, looking for her lost head. The girl was in a canoe, and someone had tied fishing line across the water between two trees in the area where she was canoeing. The girl was paddling very fast, and she was unable to see the nearly invisible monofilament line. As the story goes, she went straight through it, and the line sliced into her, cutting off her head. They say that you can see the ghost of this girl paddling down Blue River, looking for her head almost every night. From Ohio, United States of America. There was a wealthy farmer who owned a lot of land in Ohio. He built a new barn on his property every time his wife had a baby. He named the barns after each of his children, and by the time the story takes place, they had 6 kids and were soon expecting number 7. However, the farmer's wife died in childbirth, and so did their unborn baby. The farmer allegedly went insane with grief and couldn't tend to his farm. The family had no money, and the farm started going under. They say that one night, in the depths of his madness and despair, the farmer took an axe and led his children out to the barns where he murdered them, one by one. He buried each of their bodies in the 6 barns that had been named after them. And then the farmer went to the 7th barn and he allegedly hung himself. As the story goes, all of the barns were eventually torn down and the land was sold off, all except for the 7th barn. No one wanted to buy the land because of what had happened there, so it was abandoned and soon fell into disrepair. They say that if you go to that barn at night, you can see the ghost of a farmer hanging from the rafters, his body swinging back and forth in the wind, dwelling on his terrible crime for all eternity. No one was ever really sure where the 7th barn was located, although it was definitely in Ohio. Some said it was the Kranz farm in Cuyahoga Valley, and others said it was at Top of the World in Northampton. In 1997, a local Ohio teacher claimed that after a lot of research, he had finally managed to track down the real location of the infamous 7th barn. He said that none of the barns had ever actually been torn down. The land had just been divided up and sold off, and the barns had simply been incorporated into neighboring farms. According to the teacher, he was able to pinpoint the correct location because all of the barns on neighboring properties had nameplates above their doors with the names of children engraved on them. The teacher and his son set out at night to visit the barn, bringing a video camera with them with the hopes of capturing some paranormal activity. The next morning, the teacher's wife reported that her husband and her son were missing. After a brief investigation, the police found their abandoned car by the roadside. While searching the area, they entered a barn in a nearby field and found the dead bodies of the teacher and his son hanging from the rafters. From Louisville, Kentucky, United States of America. The place known today as Hot Rod Haven is actually a winding and twisting stretch of road called Mitchell Hill Road. Years ago, it used to be a popular spot for teenagers to go and test their racing skills and their cars. That all ended when 2 teenagers did not come back alive. Back in 1946, a young woman, Sarah Mitchell, and her date, Roy Clark, were on their way to a dance. As they were coming down the hill, Clark lost control of the car and crashed at the curve. Both teenagers were killed on impact. Since that time, reports claim that the girl's ghost has been seen wandering up the roadway and aimlessly strolling the cemetery at the top of the hill. Over the years, many drivers have claimed to see the apparition on the road during the night. From Clifton, Virginia, United States of America. After the Civil War, Fairfax County, Virginia, became more populated, and eventually an insane asylum was built there. No one wanted to live near the asylum, and because of the public outrage, the institution was shut down. The administration transferred the patients, and in 1904, the process was completed. During the transfer, some of the patients actually managed to escape and hid in the surrounding woods and forests. A lot of these individuals were labeled to be lost humans, delusional, and very dangerous. Most of them were found, except for Marcus Loster and Douglas Griffin. The local authorities found a trail they believed belonged to them, littered with half-eaten, mutilated bunnies. The trail led deep into the woods to a tunnel bridge crossing a wide creek. There, they found Marcus hanging from the tunnel entrance. There was a note attached to his foot that said, "You'll never find me, no matter how hard you try. signed the Bunnyman. That tunnel has been called Bunnyman Bridge ever since. The legend says that if you walk all the way down the tunnel at around midnight, the Bunnyman will grab you and hang you from the entrance of the bridge. Strange deaths and phenomena have been connected with the Bunnyman Bridge. There was a young man from Clifton, Virginia, who came upon the bridge while traveling. Later, he killed his parents and dragged their bodies into the woods to hang them from the bridge, and then killed himself. In 1943, 3 teenagers, 2 men and a young woman, were at the Bunnyman Bridge for Halloween night. The 3 youths were found dead, hung from the bridge with their bodies slashed open. All of the teenagers had notes attached to their feet saying the same thing: "You'll never catch the Bunnyman." In 2001, after hearing the tale, 6 local students and a guide searched the area. They found mutilated bunny parts during their search and left the forest after they heard noises and saw figures moving around in the woods. From Marion County, Ohio, United States of America. Everyone in Marion County, Ohio, has heard the legend of the Mongoloid House. Today the house is abandoned and there is graffiti on the walls saying, "Leave while you can," and "This is hell." According to the legend, the house was the site of a number of gruesome murders and is now said to be haunted. As the story goes, the first occupants of the house were a Civil War veteran and his wife. The couple couldn't have kids, but when the wife suddenly got pregnant, the husband was suspicious. She ended up giving birth to 2 children, a boy and a girl. However, the children were hideously deformed. The husband refused to believe that the children were his and became convinced that his wife had been cheating on him. One terrible night, the couple had a fight and the man flew into a rage. He killed his wife with a shotgun, then set the house on fire and hung himself from the rafters. Somehow, the children escaped from the blaze and they continued to live in the burned-out shell of a house, surrounded by the charred corpses of their parents. As the years passed, the children grew up and had children of their own. With each successive generation, the children that were born became more and more deformed. They say that back in the 1960s, the family who lived on the property were a peculiar-looking bunch with hunched backs, high foreheads, big heads, stocky builds, and close-set eyes. Some people claim that the family were all mentally challenged or mentally handicapped. Teenagers would often drive by the house and antagonize the family by honking their horns or harassing them by shining their flashlights on the house. The people in the house would come running out and throw rocks at cars and beat on them with baseball bats. The crazed family would often be seen hanging from the trees like monkeys or jumping out of ditches at passers-by. Some say they would fire shotguns into the air as a warning or even shoot at the cars. Others claim that they had paths through the fields and would use them to cut through and come out in front of your car, blocking you, and if you got out of your car, they would possibly chase you down and try to kill you. Today, the Mongoloid House is abandoned and nobody knows what happened to the crazed family. They say that if you visit the barn, you might hear strange noises and smell the stench of sulfur in the second story. The house is also said to be haunted, and if you go into the basement of the house for more than 2 to 5 minutes, you start to feel invisible hands touching you all over your body. One young man who ventured out of the house tells this story. Me and my 2 friends went there at about 1 o'clock a.m., and as soon as we pulled into the driveway, we saw a man's face inside the house. We got out of the car, and as we walked up there, we all started feeling something. It was 80 degrees outside, and we decided to go down into the basement. It was so cold down there, and there was a junk refrigerator downstairs, and all of a sudden, it started running. We decided to go back upstairs, and we walked out to the first barn where we heard a man's voice growl, "Go away!" We went out to the other barn, and all of a sudden we heard a little girl screaming and crying. We kept hearing that man's growling voice saying, "Get out of here! Get out of here!" So we started walking back towards the house. Just then, we heard a loud noise come from the first barn. Ever since then, we've been back out there a bunch of times, both day and night. There's definitely something out there. From Illinois, United States of America. If you drive about a mile north of Libertyville in northern Illinois, down the desolate and secluded River Road, you'll come to a place where the road makes a sharp right turn. If you look very closely, set back from the road, you'll find a menacing-looking iron gate. According to local legend, in the 1920s, the Libertyville Gate was the entrance to an exclusive girls' finishing school. It was a quiet and polished place where young girls from Chicago's well-to-do families were able to receive a proper education. All went well until one terrible night in the 1950s when the school principal allegedly snapped and killed 4 of the young girls in his care. As the legend goes, the mild-mannered principal inexplicably lost his mind one night and in a fit of madness murdered the girls. Then, for unknown reasons, he chopped off their heads, carried them down to the gate, and placed them on top of the spikes on the gate. The bodies of the girls were never found, and the principal was arrested and tried for his crime. The authorities tried to hush up the whole incident, but the parents refused to send their children to the school, and it had to close down. As time went on, the horrible murders were all but forgotten. The girls' school was demolished, and by the end of the 1950s, the property was being used as a sleepaway camp for boys. All was well until one horrible night in 1963, when a camp counselor discovered that 4 young boys were missing from their tent. In the dark, the counselor searched the grounds for the missing children, but they could not find any trace of them. As it grew lighter outside, they approached the gate, and they discovered the remains of the missing boys. Their severed heads had been stuck on the spikes of the iron gate, and their bodies were never found, and their killer was never identified. The police suspected that one of the camp counselors had committed the crime, but there was never enough evidence to prove any of it. After the scandal, the camp was forced to close down, and the property has lain vacant ever since. It is said that the gate is haunted by the children who had died there. People who pass by the gate at night claim to have heard the sounds of children crying and screaming. Others claim to have seen blood running down the wrought iron supports of the gate. They say that if you go to the gate at midnight on the anniversary of the murders, you will see the phantom heads of the girls and boys appear on the rusted spikes. Their eyes will be staring straight at you, and their mouths will be moving, stretching wide open, as if they are silently screaming out. But if you and your friends ever decide to go and visit the gate at night, just be careful. They say that the area can have a strange effect on people's minds. You just may notice that one of your friends starts acting in a very bizarre manner, and the next morning, it could be your head that is found on top of the rusty spikes of the Libertyville Gate. From Cordoba, Spain. The story of the gold coins is an urban legend that can be heard all over the city of Cordoba in Spain. Over the years, it has passed from person to person by word of mouth. According to the legend, in the center of Cordoba, there is an old, dilapidated house that is said to be haunted. The house is very big and has many, many rooms. All of the floors in this house are covered in black tiles. Many years ago, it was owned by one of the most important and wealthy families in the city. The family consisted of a man, his wife, and their 8-year-old daughter. They also had a team of servants and maids who lived with them. One night, when the little girl was lying in bed, unable to sleep, she heard some noises in the corridor outside of her room. Being the curious child that she was, she slowly opened the door of her bedroom and looked out into the long, dark corridor. At the end of the hallway, she could make out a small figure crouching down. As her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she was surprised to see a young boy, roughly the same age as herself. He was carrying a lighted candle in his hand, and he was lifting one of the small stone slabs on the tiled floor. She watched as the young boy took something from his pocket and placed it beneath the tile. After he replaced the tile, the boy suddenly vanished into thin air. The little girl couldn't believe what she was seeing. She looked back down the corridor and noticed that one of the maids had been peeking out of her own bedroom door and had witnessed the same strange scene. The maid grabbed a candle and came hurrying over to the little girl. They both knew what they had just seen. The young boy was obviously a ghost. Together, the maid and the little girl cautiously approached the place where the boy had been crouching. They lifted the tile and discovered that there was a large hole underneath it. Peering down into the hole by the dim light of the candle, they noticed that there was something down there, something that was kind of glittering, something that was glimmering. The maid held up the slab as she lowered the little girl into the hole. The child could not believe what she had found. It was a pile of gold coins. Shaking with excitement, she gathered up the coins and handed them out to the maid, and then the maid grabbed her by the hand and pulled her out of the hole. They replaced the tile, and it fit back perfectly, looking like it had never been moved. The maid could hardly believe her luck, and the child could barely contain her excitement. Both of them decided that they should keep the discovery of the gold coins a secret. The maid warned the little girl not to mention anything about their find to her parents or to any of the other servants. The next night, at the same time, the girl and the maid were peeking out of their bedroom doors, eagerly awaiting for the ghostly little boy to appear. They watched as a spectral figure made its way down the corridor, lifted a tile, and placed some gold coins into the hole beneath. After the figure disappeared, the maid once again lowered the girl into the hole under the slab so that she could retrieve the gold coins. Night after night, they repeated the same process. It seemed as if the treasure would never end. Each time, by the light of the candle, the girl got down into the small, narrow hole under the tile and gave the coins to the maid, who put them inside of a big sack. One night, the candle was almost finished, and as the maid lowered the girl into the hole, the light started to flicker. The maid told the little girl to hurry up. She had to get out of the hole before the candle went out, because they already had enough money. She pulled the little girl out of the hole, but at the last moment, one of the coins fell from the child's hands. Without thinking, the little girl jumped back into the hole again. The maid tried to catch her, but in doing so, she let go of the tile, and it slammed down, covering the hole. Suddenly, the candle went out. The maid began to panic. In the darkness, she tried to make her way down the corridor to her bedroom to fetch another candle. It was pitch black and she couldn't see a thing. She had to feel her way along the wall until she reached her bedroom door. As she searched desperately in the dark, she couldn't seem to find any other candles. With a lot of difficulty, the maid felt her way down the darkened corridor until she came to the kitchen. She rummaged through the drawers and eventually came across another candle. She lit it and she quickly returned to the corridor. To her horror, the maid realized that she couldn't remember which tile the little girl was under. In the dim light, she searched and searched, prying at each tile, but the corridor was so long and so wide, and there were so many tiles that she was unable to find the right one. Finally, she gave up, and clutching her bag of gold coins, she returned back to her bedroom and crawled into her bed. In the morning, the little girl's parents woke up to find that their daughter had disappeared. They questioned the servants, but each one said that they had no idea where the little girl could be. A complete search of the entire house was organized, but it turned up nothing. The distraught parents were baffled by their daughter's mysterious disappearance. The maid decided not to say anything about what had happened that night. A few days later, the mother was crying in her bedroom when she heard a voice calling out. She recognized the voice immediately. It was the voice of her daughter. The little girl was crying out for someone to help her. "Help me! Let me out of here! Help me, please!" The mother searched the house again. Sometimes the screams seemed to be coming from one part of the house, but when she got there, the screams sounded like they were coming from somewhere else. Try as they might, the parents could not pinpoint the source of the screams. The father dug up floors, demolished walls, and punched holes in ceilings, all in an effort to figure out where the girl's cries for help were coming from. After almost destroying the interior of the house, the parents were forced to admit defeat. For months, they lived in the building, listening to the incessant cries of their beloved daughter, tragically unable to do anything to find her. All of this took its toll on their mental and physical health, and eventually the mother lost her mind and committed suicide. The father, devastated by grief, moved away, and he died of a heart attack just a few short years later. The people of Cordoba say that this is a true story and that the house is still standing today. According to the legend, if you go there at night, they say that you can still hear the screams of a little girl pleading for help. The house has become famous all over Spain, and sometimes teenagers visit the place at night to test their courage and see if they can find any gold coins. Others go there to explore the huge building in an attempt to discover where the remains of the little girl are located. As of yet, there are no known accounts of anyone who has been brave enough to spend an entire night in the house. The house is now boarded up, and the neighbors often call the police because of the strange cries and screams that come from within. They say that when the police arrive to investigate, the only thing that they find is an old candle sitting on an old stone tile in the middle of the floor. From Lima, Peru. There's a strange bright yellow house in Lima, Peru that is said to be cursed. The name of the house is La Casa Matusita, and according to legend, a group of people met a grisly end on the second floor of the old building. Many years ago, an old man lived in the yellow house. He had a wife and children and lived with his servants, a butler, and a cook. The man occupied the second floor of the yellow house, and his servants lived on the ground floor. The man was said to be ill-tempered and treated his servants very badly, constantly mistreating them and insulting them. The servants were filled with hatred for the man, and they vowed to someday get their revenge. As the legend goes, the servants came up with a plan in which they would publicly embarrass their employer. One day, the old man was holding a dinner party. When his guests arrived and were seated in the dining room, the servants decided to take their revenge. They had allegedly obtained illegal hallucinogenic drugs, LSD in particular, and put them in the food that they were serving to the man and his guests. Then the servants walked out, quietly locking the dining room door behind them. They retired to the kitchen to await the results of their plan. After about 15 minutes, they heard angry voices and the sounds of plate smashing. They chuckled to themselves. This was followed by violent yells and blood-curdling screams. At this point, the servants began to get a little bit worried. After the noises had died down, the butler and the cook opened the door of the dining room and were horrified by the gruesome scene that they discovered inside. The walls and the ceiling were splattered with blood. On the floor lay mangled bodies and body parts, eyes, hands, internal organs, and severed heads. The faces of the guests were twisted masks of hate and terror. Each and every guest at the dinner party, including the old man, had met a brutal and terrifying end. Driven insane by the hallucinogenic drugs, the guests had apparently murdered each other in the most appalling ways imaginable. The sight of so much savagery caused the servants to lose their minds. Horrified by the massacre that they had caused, and fearing that they would be executed by the law, the servants then took their own lives, hanging themselves from the ceiling of the dining room. Ever since then, the Yellow House in Peru had a reputation for being haunted. Most people were afraid to go near the place. It is said that the house began to fall into ruin until it was purchased years later by a property developer. Later, a Japanese family moved into the house. They were completely unaware of the history of the old building and its fearsome reputation. The night they moved in, the husband allegedly took a knife, murdered his entire family, and then killed himself. After that, the house lay vacant for many years until a local priest was asked to perform an exorcism there. The owners wanted the house to be cleansed so that it could be sold. The priest entered the first floor with no problem. It was only when he set foot on the second floor that he allegedly had a panic attack that amplified in intensity and resulted in his death. Another of the best-known cases is that of Humberto Viravilches, a television host from the 1960s, who made a bet live on the air, saying that he would be able to spend 7 nights alone in the house. He managed to stay 1 night, and the next morning he was found lying outside on the pavement. He had allegedly lost his mind and had to be confined to a mental asylum. He was never on television and rarely ever heard from again. It is said that from time to time, ghostly screams and yells can be heard coming from La Casa Matosita. Some people have even seen ghostly figures lurking in the second-floor windows. Today, the first floor of the Yellow House is rented out to a business. The second floor is kept unoccupied and securely locked up. According to legend, if a group of people goes to stay the night on the second floor of the Yellow House, they will go insane during the night and slaughter each other, reenacting the terrible events that happened there years before. From Malaysia. Aisha was a shy country girl who lived in Malaysia. She was born in a small village, but in 1984 she moved to Kuala Lumpur, the capital city of Malaysia. Aisha suffered from a rare disease that gave her photophobia. It meant that her eyes were extremely sensitive to bright light, and it caused her to have severe pounding headaches. For this reason, Aisha always wore dark sunglasses and never allowed anyone to take her photograph. The flash of the camera was capable of causing her horrible, debilitating headaches. One day, the factory where Aisha worked was holding its annual party. Everyone was having fun, and Aisha took off her sunglasses. Someone at the party had a camera and decided to take a picture. As soon as the flash went off, Aisha doubled over in pain and collapsed onto the ground. She was suffering from an intense headache, and she began to foam at the mouth. The poor girl writhed on the ground until an ambulance arrived and took her to the hospital. Aisha spent 3 days in the hospital, lying in a darkened room. The man who had taken her picture came to visit her and apologized for his carelessness. After that, Aisha was forced to stop working. The doctors gave her some medication and told her to spend a long time resting. She simply sat at home and only went out at night when it was dark to buy her food. Her landlord sympathized with her situation and allowed Aisha to stay in the apartment without paying rent until she was healthy enough to return home. 1 month later, Aisha was fully recovered, and it was time for her to make the trip back to the village where she was born. That night, after it was dark, Aisha left the house and walked to the bus station. On the way, a car suddenly pulled up in front of her, and 4 men got out. They blocked her path, and when she tried to go around them, they grabbed her and dragged her into the car. The men kidnapped her and took her to an empty house on the outskirts of the city. They tied her hands and her feet to a chair, and then one of them took out a knife and cut off her clothes. Aisha was crying and begging them to have mercy on her, but the men just laughed at her, and they began beating her and abusing her horribly. At one point, one of the men took out a camera to take some photos. Aisha begged him not to take her picture and tried to explain that she had a rare condition that made her extremely sensitive to light. Of course, a man such as this simply ignored her pleas and started snapping pictures. As soon as the blinding flash went off, Aisha was struck by an intense headache. Her head was pounding and she was screaming in pain. The men just kept beating her, taking picture after picture. Every time the flash went off, she felt like her head was going to explode. Soon after, blood began flowing from her nose, ears, and eyes. After suffering for more than 4 hours, Aisha was in terrible pain and she could barely move. She was still tied up, and the men carried her out to their car and tossed her into the trunk. They drove her out to a bridge and told her they were going to dump her into the river and let her drown. Just before they threw her into the icy waters, Aisha screamed out, "Anyone who looks at my picture without permission, I will punish them in a dream with the same pain that I am experiencing. I swear I will. Though I'm dead, woe to those who see the picture." The next morning, the 4 men went to the photo shop to get the photos developed. They gave the man behind the counter some money and warned him to keep silent about the contents of the pictures. When the men saw the developed photos of Aisha, helpless and embarrassed, nude and beaten, they began to shriek with sinister laughter. Suddenly, the car in which they were traveling in swerved and crashed into a tree. One of the branches came through the windshield and smashed straight through the driver's head, killing him instantly. A second man was taken to hospital, but died that evening from severe internal bleeding. A third man survived the crash with only minor injuries, and after bandaging his wounds, the doctors allowed him to leave. On the way back to his house, the man tripped and fell into an open manhole. He lay at the bottom of the sewer with a broken leg, unable to climb back up. That night, it rained heavily, and the water level rose in the sewer, and the man drowned. The fourth man didn't have a scratch on him, and he went straight home. That night, as he lay in bed, he dreamed that Aisha came to him and began beating him about the head with a stick. When he awoke, he had an extremely bad headache. The pain grew so intense that he couldn't take it anymore. He felt like he was losing his mind, and he started stabbing himself in the head with a fork. He began to regret what he had done and felt like he was being cursed by Aisha. He went to the nearest police station and turned himself in, telling them everything he did to Aisha on that fateful night. All the pictures he had taken were handed over to the police. The man was arrested and he was thrown in a cell while police began the search for Aisha's body. That man eventually died in prison. He took his own life by banging his head against the wall until his skull was crushed. He was unable to endure the unbearable headaches any longer. 2 days later, Aisha's bloated corpse was found floating in the river. She was taken to the mortuary where they identified her from her fingerprints and performed an autopsy. The doctor who carried out the post-mortem examination had to take a picture of Aisha's corpse as evidence. When the flash from the camera went off, he was shocked to see Aisha's eyelids suddenly close. Not long afterwards, the doctor was found dead due to an overdose of painkillers. Anyone who looked at the autopsy photographs reportedly experienced nightmares and severe headaches. Shortly after that, they were found dead under mysterious circumstances. Eventually, the police destroyed most of the pictures. They tried to keep the case secret from the public, but rumors of Aisha's curse began to circulate all around Malaysia. Some of the post-mortem photographs that were taken of Aisha were leaked and posted on the internet. They say that anyone who looks at these pictures will encounter the ghost of Aisha in their dreams. When they wake up, they will experience severe and chronic headaches. The image of Aisha's corpse will haunt them no matter where they go, and wherever they look, Aisha's picture will appear in their vision. To avoid Aisha's curse, I beg of you, do not search for her pictures online. If you accidentally come across the pictures, please do not look directly into her eyes. Do not send these pictures to anyone. If you do, it will mean certain death for both you and them. From Mexico. Today, if you are traveling in Mexico, between the city of Toluca and the town of Ixtapan de la Sal, there is a lovely highway that makes the journey quick and easy. However, years ago, anyone making that journey was forced to travel along a dangerous and winding mountain road. On one side of the narrow road, there was a steep vertical rock, and on the other side, there was a sheer drop. One evening, many years ago, a bus departed from Ixtapan de la Sal, as usual, making the familiar journey to Toluca. It was an overnight trip, so the passengers on the bus took the opportunity to get some much-needed sleep. When the bus reached the base of the mountain, it started the slow climb up the slope without any problems. Most of the passengers had made this trip many times, and they noticed nothing out of the ordinary. When the bus reached the highest point on the mountain, it began to rain, and the driver negotiated the dangerous curves as the road descended. Some very serious accidents had occurred on this stretch of road, and many of them had been fatal. The bus began its descent in heavy rain, and the road was slick and wet. The passengers who were awake became a little nervous when they realized that the bus was picking up speed. This seemed very unusual. Some of the passengers called out to the driver, but the driver didn't seem to respond. The speed of the bus became faster and faster, and the passengers became more and more frightened. Suddenly, the driver cried out, "The brakes are failing!" The bus was traveling at such a high speed that it was impossible to control. In the blink of an eye, they reached a curve, and the driver swerved. They skidded off of the cliff and plunged into the void below. The bus tumbled down the rocky slope and smashed into the jagged rocks. Many of the passengers were killed instantly in the crash. Others lay unconscious and bleeding in the wreckage. Then the bus caught fire, and within minutes it was completely consumed by the flames. No one heard the chilling cries of the surviving passengers, and they all died in the most dreadful and horrible way imaginable. Later that night, the police located the site of the crash and called an ambulance. Unfortunately, it was of no use. There were no survivors. The bodies of some passengers lay strewn about on the sharp rocks. The bodies of others lay charred inside the smoking wreckage. Ever since that day, people have reported seeing the old bus traveling late at night on the road from Iztapan de la Sal to Toluca. They say that if you hold out your hand, the bus will stop for you. The doors will open when you approach it. You'll notice that the bus is old, but still in good condition. Even if the bus seems to be full, there will always be one empty seat waiting for you. If you sit down, you will feel a strange emptiness in the pit of your stomach, and you will soon realize that something is very, very wrong. Despite the late hour, no one on the bus is asleep. All of the men, women, and children are wide awake, staring straight forward, but no one says a word, and there is a heavy silence. A few minutes later, the bus conductor will walk down the aisle, checking tickets. As anyone would, you begin to prepare the money to pay for your ticket, but the bus conductor will just pass you by. You arrive at Toluca smoothly, but after midnight. The driver stops the bus before arriving at the bus terminal, and then he turns and tells you that you have to get off. The journey isn't finished, and you don't understand why, but you need to obey him. While everyone else stays seated, you'll get up and you'll walk down the aisle. As you pass by the driver, you will likely again attempt to pay for your ticket, and the bus driver will just wave your money away. "There is no charge," the driver will say. "Go now, and don't look back, or you will never leave this bus." Those who obey, who do not look behind, hear the sound of the door closing and the bus engine starting up as the bus drives off. The disobedient who turn around will see that the bus is really a charred wreck. Inside, they'll see that the emaciated skeletons that line the seats are staring silently through the windows. The bus will disappear, and then, as the story goes, that person will die in an accident just a few days later. It is said, if you're one of the disobedient ones, that from that moment on, your ghost will then become a passenger sitting on the bus. If by chance you travel to Iztapan de la Sal one day, do not risk journeying to Toluca at night. There is a chance that you might meet the ghost bus. If you disobey this warning, and if you do meet the ghost bus, make sure that you obey the driver's instructions. Otherwise, you will be condemned to travel on that bus for all eternity. From Missouri, United States of America. One dark and rainy night, a farmer's daughter was driving home from her job in town. As she neared her house, she drove up a small hill. She was driving far too fast for the wet weather, and her car began to slide, and she crashed into a tree. Unfortunately, she wasn't wearing her seatbelt, and the force of the impact caused her to be thrown through the windshield. The police and the fire department arrived and were horrified by what they found. When they tried to get her out of the car, they realized that she was dead. She had been decapitated by the crash. Her body was stuck halfway through the windshield, but her head was nowhere to be found. Police searched all over the area with flashlights, but they couldn't figure out what had happened to her head. They then decided to wait until daylight to continue the search further. They broke the horrible news to her father, who collapsed in tears. The next morning, her grieving father returned to the scene of the accident to help the police search for his daughter's severed head, but they never found it. They say her poor father had to bury her without her head, and it was a closed coffin funeral. In the years afterwards, her father became obsessed with finding the missing head. Every day he was said to have searched up and down the road in vain. At night, he would come back with a lantern and search the fields around the area, hoping to find some trace of his daughter's head, but to no avail. The father lost all interest in life. He let his farm fall to ruin. He couldn't eat, he couldn't sleep, he couldn't live until he found the head. His health failed, and he died soon afterwards, never having found his daughter's head. Since then, many neighbors say that they have seen the light from the old man's lantern still moving up and down Spook Light Hill at night. They say his ghost has been seen lurking in the shadows of Spook Light Hill, walking up and down, back and forth, still searching for that missing head. From Peru. The whistling sound is a well-known legend in the Peruvian rainforest. Stories about the evil spirit they call El Tunchi have been passed on from generation to generation in Peru. They say it is the ghost of a troubled man who wandered off, became lost and disoriented, and died in the rainforest. His evil spirit now roams through the forest, whistling at those unlucky enough to cross his path. His whistling sound is high-pitched, and as it goes on, it gets louder and louder until it's almost unbearable. The natives who know the story say that if you hear the whistling sound, you must beware. Make the sign of the cross and say a prayer. Cover your ears if you must, but never acknowledge that you hear anything. If you do, the sound will only get louder as El Tunchi draws nearer and nearer. Whatever you do, you must never answer El Tunchi's whistle. If you whistle back, El Tunchi will come for you and kill you in the most hideous ways imaginable. Legend has it that there was a young Catholic nun named Sister Bernadette who had just taken her vows in Spain. She was sent to Peru as a missionary and joined a group of older nuns who had been living and doing charity work in a small village in the rainforest. Soon afterwards, the nuns took a trip by boat to visit a remote village in the rainforest. That night, the nuns gathered in the center of the village to say the rosary before going to bed. This was a tradition that they observed every night. During the second Hail Mary, the young Sister Bernadette interrupted the prayers. "What's that whistling sound?" she asked. The older nuns did not answer her and continued with their prayers. "Can't you hear it?" she asked again. "It's a high-pitched whistling sound." "There's no whistling sound," replied one of the older nuns nervously. "You must hear it," insisted Sister Bernadette. "It's almost like the sound of a fingernail scraping against a blackboard, but it's somehow different, like the whistle of a strange creature." "You don't hear it, and neither do we," hissed another nun. The old nuns all eyed each other nervously and remained silent. Sister Bernadette was surprised by their bizarre behavior. "What? You must be able to hear it. It's getting louder. It's awful," she cried, and with that she began whistling, answering the strange sound. The moment the young nun answered the whistling sound, it abruptly ceased. Sister Bernadette continued whistling, despite the protests of the other nuns. The older nuns blessed themselves, making the sign of the cross, and said a prayer. The nuns all went to bed as usual. That same night, while they were all asleep, they heard a piercing scream come from the room in which Sister Bernadette was staying. The older nuns rushed to help her, but when they opened the door, they recoiled in horror. The room was covered from floor to ceiling in the blood of Sister Bernadette, yet Sister Bernadette was nowhere to be found. Days later, her body was discovered, deep within the rainforest, hanging from a tree. Her throat had been torn out, and her arms and legs were broken and twisted at odd angles. Most distressing of all was the look of unimaginable horror that remained frozen on her face. Officially, she was listed as having been killed by a wild animal, but the old nuns knew what had happened to her. The local villagers had told them all about El Tunchi and the terrible fate that awaited anyone who answered its strange whistling call. Another story involves a 14-year-old girl whose father was working as an English teacher in a small village in a Peruvian rainforest. One day, the girl was looking out the window when she spotted a dark shadow moving through the forest. She heard a strange whistling sound and began to answer it. The teacher returned home to find his daughter standing at the window, whistling a strange tune. "What are you doing?" he asked the girl. "Whistling at that dark figure over there in the trees," she replied. The teacher froze, and the hair on the back of his neck stood up. He had heard the legends about El Tunchi, and he knew what was happening. In a panic, he grabbed his daughter and dragged her upstairs to her bedroom. He bolted the bedroom door tightly and closed the shutters on the windows. The young girl was terrified as she watched her father get down on his knees and start lighting candles. She was crying and asking her father what was wrong, but all her father would say was, "El Tunchi, El Tunchi, El Tunchi." Suddenly, she heard an almighty crash against the door to her bedroom. Without thinking twice, her father pushed her into the closet and locked her inside. Then he broke the key off in the lock. Inside the closet, the frightened girl could hear her father crying and saying prayers. Then, she heard the bedroom door burst open, and her father began screaming in horror. The bedroom window shattered, and glass rained down on the wooden floor. The girl covered her ears as her father's screams faded off into the distance. The next morning, the girl was found by one of the villagers who was investigating the damage to the house. She was taken to a hospital and treated for shock. Her father had disappeared, and his body was never found. The girl was adopted by her aunt and her uncle, and even today, she still sleeps inside a locked closet at night. She says that she lives in fear that someday El Tunchi is going to return for her. From Peru. My name is Enrique, and I am from Peru. I am a military man by profession, and as such, I often travel to some of the most exotic and remote regions of my country. 5 years ago, I had probably one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. Although it only lasted a few minutes, it felt like it went on for an eternity. A group of us from the Peruvian army were sent to conduct training exercises in the Departamento de Amazonas, which is in the north of the country on the border with Ecuador. The region is quite isolated, and most of it is covered by rainforest. Our army barracks was located in a place called Misiones Muro. Part of our duties was to train the local recruits in the techniques of jungle warfare. Some of the men in the group were from a race of indigenous people who live in the rainforest. They call them Aguarunas. It was just after midnight when we came to a clearing and decided to make camp. Everything was dark and green. The moonlight couldn't penetrate the thick canopy of trees in the jungle. We were close to a single dirt road that was lined with stones. The night had progressed without incident, and there was no reason to think anything unusual would happen. But in the next few minutes, all of that would change completely. We sat watching the endless stretch of deserted road as the Aguarunas pitched their tents. The jungle was hot and humid, even at night, and sweat was trickling down my face. As I sat, mopping my brow, I suddenly felt an icy wind, and at that moment I felt so cold that I began looking for somewhere to take shelter. It was so unusual that some of the men thought that it must be a signal that a heavy rain was approaching. Sometimes the torrential rainfall is accompanied by cold winds. However, this was like the cold of winter, the kind of cold you feel take hold of your body, right down to the bones. The Aguarunas abruptly stopped what they were doing and began whispering to each other in their own language. We couldn't understand what they were saying, but by the looks on their faces, they seemed terrified. When I asked them what was happening, I was shocked by their response. One of them looked at me wide-eyed and hissed, "Approaching evil." Another tried to explain, "Someone want to hurt us." All of a sudden, we heard high-pitched whistling sounds echoing around the jungle. The Aguarunas blessed themselves, making the sign of the cross, and covered their ears. "There is no sound," said one, with his voice shaking. "I can hear nothing," cried another. One of my colleagues, a man named Ramon, turned to me with a puzzled expression. "What's that whistling sound?" he asked. "No," shouted one of the Aguarunas. "There is only silence." "You can't hear that?" asked Ramon. "It's a high-pitched whistling sound, like..." In that moment, I couldn't tell what was going on, but I believe that the native people know of things that most of us have forgotten. Seeing the frightened look on their faces, I decided that it would be smart to do whatever they were doing, if only for the sake of superstition. I made the sign of the cross, then covered my ears and said loudly to my colleague, "Like they say, there is no sound." "Have you all gone crazy?" he said in disbelief. "I can hear it with my own ears." Just then, there was a tremendous crash, as if several trees were splitting apart. What we saw in that split second was the most horrible thing I have ever laid my eyes on. In my profession, I've seen some horrible things. I've seen people maimed. I've seen people die. But what I experienced that day was the scariest thing that I have ever witnessed in my life. A black shape emerged from the jungle. It swooped down over us, and before anybody had a chance to react, it was gone. In an instant, it disappeared back into the jungle, and I was left crouching there, unsure if what I had seen was real or imagined. No one moved. No one spoke a word. I couldn't tell you if anyone even took a breath. The silence was then broken by one of the Aguarunas screaming, "It took him!" Looking to my left, I realized that Ramon was nowhere to be seen. In the place where he had been standing just seconds before, there was nothing but dark green vegetation and a pair of empty boots. As a consequence of this apparition, 2 of my soldiers were hospitalized in a medical center nearby. The doctor said that they were suffering from mental illness. According to the Aguarunas, when this thing came out of the jungle and took Ramon, it also snatched these men's souls. Personally, I cannot explain what happened to them. Something turned them from brave soldiers into shaking, hollow shells. I asked the Aguarunas what we had encountered that night. None of them would say it out loud, but one wrote it down on a piece of paper and handed it to me. He had scrawled, El Tunchi. It just means the whistling sound. I believe that good and evil really exist, and that night I feel that we experienced pure, unadulterated evil. However, this is not how my story ends. The Peruvian army launched an investigation into Ramon's disappearance. They listened to the testimony of the Aguarunas, then they dismissed them as little more than superstitious natives. When I tried to tell them what I had seen, they were not convinced. I was interrogated for hours, during which they accused me of being delusional and asked if we had all been on drugs and suffered hallucinations. About a week later, I was back in the jungle, leading a patrol that consisted of several Aguarunas and 2 other enlisted men. We were much deeper in the jungle than we had ever been before, and when we came to a clearing, I heard one of the Aguarunas suddenly cry out. He was pointing up into the trees. We followed the direction he was pointing in and looked up. There we saw Ramon. His body had been strung up in the highest branches. It was a grisly sight. His body was sliced open from his neck to his waist. His guts were hanging out, and his intestines were draped across the branches. His legs were nothing but bone and sinew. And then it got worse. We heard his voice, begging and pleading for us to cut him down. I took a few steps forward, and one of the Aguarunas put his hand out and stopped me. "It's not your friend anymore," he warned sternly. "Look at him, how he still lives." "Be careful," warned another. "It's a trick. In this way it tries to lure us." Sure enough, when I strained my eyes to see, I realized that his mouth wasn't moving. He was obviously dead, and yet the begging and pleading continued. Another of the Aguarunas took aim and fired at Ramon's head. The bullet struck him right between the eyes. His head slumped to the right, and the cries for help ceased abruptly. When we got back from patrol that day, none of us said a word about it to our commanding officers. They wouldn't have believed us anyway. From Venezuela. El Silbon, or the man who whistles, is a frightening figure who appears at night in rural areas. He is a tall, skinny man with a deformed face who carries a bag of bones on his back. El Silbon is famous for the eerie tune that he whistles. Do, re, mi, fa, so, la, ti. They say it can make the hair stand up on the back of your neck and the blood freeze in your veins. If his whistling sounds very loud, it means that he is far away. If the whistling sound is very faint, it means that El Silbon is nearby and you should immediately flee the area. Years ago, there was a young boy who lived with his mother, father, and grandfather in Los Llanos, Venezuela. They lived a very simple life, tending to their farm. However, the boy was pampered by his parents, and what they raised was a very spoiled child. He was extremely demanding, ordering his parents around and refusing to eat certain foods. The boy had no respect for anyone. He would make a big fuss, shouting and screaming until he got his way. His poor parents were worn out from simply trying to please him. One day, the boy told his father that he wanted to eat the entrails of a deer. His father was desperate to please his spoiled son, so he went out hunting. After hours of searching through the forest, the exhausted man returned empty-handed, hanging his head in shame. The young boy flew into a rage, and taking a hunting knife, he plunged it into his father's chest again and again. Then he ripped open his father's belly and pulled out his father's guts. The boy carried his father's guts back to the house. He gave them to his mother and asked her to cook them. The mother became suspicious and asked, "Where did you get these entrails?" "Well, I got them from father," the boy replied casually. "Where did your father get them?" asked his mother. "Oh, he grew them in his belly," said the boy. The mother could not believe what she was hearing. She immediately rushed out to the forest and searched frantically for her husband. She found his corpse in a clearing. He had been disemboweled, and there was blood everywhere. The horrified woman fell to her knees and began screaming and howling in grief. When the boy's grandfather heard what he had done, he was beside himself with fury. The old man took it upon himself to punish the boy for his terrible sins. First, he tied the murderous child to a tree, and he beat him over and over with a whip until the boy's back was raw and bloody. And then he rubbed lemon juice and hot peppers into his wounds to make them sting. Finally, he handed the boy an old sack containing his father's bloody remains, and then he threw him out onto the plains. As the boy fled, his grandfather shouted after him, "You should not have done that to your father. On your head I lay a curse. You will be damned for all eternity." With that, he set his dogs on the boy, and they chased him down, nipping and biting at the boy's heels. Eventually, the dogs caught up with the boy, and they were said to have killed him. The curse transformed the boy into Silbon, an undead spirit who must roam the world eternally, followed by a spectral dog that constantly chases him. He is doomed to wander the plains, carrying the bones of his victims on his back and bringing death and destruction to anyone that he comes across. At night, Silbon enters people's homes and lays his sack of bones on the floor. He is said to start counting the bones, and if no one in the house hears him, it means that someone in the house will die before sunrise. If the family is awakened by his counting, then everyone in the house will experience good luck. Silbon is more active during the rainy season, so you should use extreme caution during this time of year. From Argentina. In Argentina, there is an urban legend that is spread by word of mouth. People take taxis every day. It is something that you do without even thinking. If it's late or if it's raining, you might try to hail a cab to take you to your destination. However, in Argentina, they say that you should never hail a cab outside of a cemetery. If you do, you may unknowingly be stepping into the dreaded Taxi de los Muertos, the death cab. Legend has it that this supernatural taxi of death lurks outside cemeteries, waiting for an unwitting victim to get inside. As the story goes, a young Argentinian woman named Claudia was on her way home one night. She had left work quite late, and it was raining heavily. She was too tired to walk all the way to her apartment, so she decided to take a taxi home instead. As she walked down the lonely street that led past the cemetery, she suddenly saw a taxi coming toward her. She held out her hand and hailed the cab. When it stopped, she climbed in and gave the driver her address. Sitting in the back seat, wiping the rain from her brow, she suddenly began to feel very cold, much colder than she had ever felt before. Looking around, she noticed that the windows were covered with ice. It was then that she realized they were going the wrong way. She was about to say something to the driver when she caught sight of his hands on the steering wheel. His skin was pale and leathery, and his fingers were almost skeletal. She couldn't see his face in the rearview mirror. "We're going the wrong way," she blurted out. The driver didn't answer. He just kept on driving, as if he hadn't heard a word she said. When she raised her hand to touch his shoulder, the driver slowly turned his head. Claudia screamed in horror. His face looked like that of a corpse. The skin was withered and clung tightly to his bones. She tried to open the back door and jump out, but the door handle came off in her hands. She tried to roll the window down, but the button didn't work. She saw a young couple walking down the street, so she shouted to them and banged on the windows, trying to attract their attention. They seemed as if they didn't hear her. The taxi continued on its way, seemingly unstoppable. Claudia became frantic. Desperate to escape, she attacked the driver and tried to scratch his face with her nails. His rotting skin came off in her hands, revealing the gleaming skull underneath. The taxi began to speed up, going faster and faster along the rain-soaked city streets. Claudia looked behind her, and on the back window she saw a sign that read, "Prepare to die." Claudia was never seen again. No one knows for certain whether or not this urban legend is true. The only ones who know for sure are the people who have been kidnapped by the death cab, and they can never tell us what has happened to them. We may never know, but just in case, take care, keep your wits about you. If you're walking by a cemetery, never, ever call a cab. From Russia. Once upon a time, there was a young man who lived in a village in Russia. He was to be married, and he and his friends prepared to go to the village where his bride-to-be lived, 2 days' walk from his own village. The first night, the two friends decided to set up camp by a river. The young man who was going to be married spotted an unusual-looking stick in the ground that looked like a bony finger. He and his friends started joking about this bony finger sticking out of the ground, and the young man who was going to be married took the golden wedding ring from his pocket and put it on the strange-looking stick, and then he started to do the wedding dance around the stick. He danced around the stick with the golden wedding ring 3 times, and he sang the Jewish wedding song and recited the entire marriage sacrament as he danced around the stick, he and his friend laughing the entire time. Their fun stopped suddenly when the earth started rumbling and shaking beneath their feet. The place where the stick had been had opened up, and a very bedraggled-looking corpse emerged. A living corpse. She had been a bride, but now was barely more than a skeleton held together by shreds of skin, still wearing an old, torn, white silk wedding dress. Worms and spiderwebs hung on the once beaded bodice and tattered veil. The 2 young men were aghast. "Ah," she said, "you have done the wedding dance and pronounced the marriage vows, and you have put a ring on my finger. Now we are man and wife. I demand my rights as your bride." Shuddering with terror at the corpse bride's words, The two young men fled to the village where the young bride was waiting to be married. They went straight to the rabbi. "Rabbi," asked the young man breathlessly, "I have a very important question to ask you. If by some chance you're walking in the woods and you happen to see a stick that looks like a long bony finger coming out of the ground, and then you happen to put a golden wedding ring on the finger and do the wedding dance and pronounce the wedding vows, is it indeed a real marriage?" Looking very puzzled, the rabbi asked, "Do you know of such a situation?" "Oh, no, of course not. It's just a hypothetical question." Stroking his long beard thoughtfully, the rabbi said, "Let me think about it." And just then, a big gust of wind blew the door open, and in walked the corpse bride. "I lay claim to this man as my husband, for he has placed this wedding ring on my finger and pronounced the solemn marriage vows," she demanded, her bony finger rattling as she shook it at her intended bridegroom. "This is indeed a very serious matter. I'll have to consult with the other rabbis," said the rabbi. Soon all the rabbis from the surrounding villages were gathered together. They went into conference while the two young men anxiously awaited their decision. The corpse bride waited on the porch, tapping her foot, declaring, "I want to celebrate my wedding night with my husband." These chilling words made every hair on the young man's body stand on end, though it was a warm summer day. While the rabbis were conferring, the real human bride arrived and wanted to know what all the fuss was about. When her fiancé explained just what had happened, she started weeping. "Oh, my life is ruined. All my hopes and dreams are shattered. I'll never be married. I'll never have a family." Just then, the rabbis came out and asked, "Did you indeed put a gold ring on the finger, and did you dance around it 3 times, and did you indeed pronounce wedding vows in their entirety?" The two young men, who by this time were cowering in a far corner, nodded their heads. Looking very serious, the rabbis went back to confer again, and the young bride wept bitter tears, while the corpse bride was by now gloating at the prospect of her long-awaited wedding night. After a short while, the rabbis solemnly marched out, took their seats, and announced, "Since you put the wedding ring on the finger of the corpse bride, and you danced around it 3 times, reciting the wedding vows, we have determined that this constitutes a proper wedding ceremony. Even so, we have decided that the dead have no claim upon the living." Sighing and murmuring could be heard from all corners. The young bride was especially relieved. The corpse bride, however, howled, "Oh, there goes my last chance for life. I'll never have my dreams fulfilled now. It's forever lost." And she collapsed on the floor. It was a pathetic sight, a heap of bones and a tattered wedding gown, lying there, lifeless. Overcome with compassion for the corpse bride, the young bride knelt down and gathered up that old heap of bones, carefully arranging the shredded silk finery and holding her close, half sang, half murmured these words as if cradling a crying infant. "Don't worry. I'll live your dreams for you. I'll live your hopes for you. I'll have your children for you. I'll have enough children for the 2 of us, and you can rest in peace knowing that our children and our children's children will be well cared for and will not forget us." Tenderly, she then closed the eyes of the corpse bride. Tenderly, she held her in her arms, and slowly and with measured steps, she marched down to the river with her fragile charge, took her down by the river where she dug a shallow grave for her, and laid her in it, and crossed the bony arms over the bony chest. the one hand clasping the one with the ring on it, and folded the wedding gown around her. Then she whispered, "May you rest in peace. I will live your dreams for you. Don't worry, we will not forget you." The corpse bride looked happy and at peace in her new grave, as if she somehow knew that she would be fulfilled through this young bride. And the young bride covered up, slowly the corpse bride, covered up the tattered wedding gown in the shallow grave, covered it all up with earth, then put wildflowers all over the grave and stones all about it. Then the young bride went back to her fiancé, and they were married in a very solemn wedding ceremony, and they lived many happy years together. And all of their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren were always told the story of the corpse bride, and so she was not forgotten, nor was the wisdom and compassion that she had taught them forgotten either. This final story comes to us from Brazil. Every schoolboy and schoolgirl in Brazil has heard the legend of a loira do banheiro, or the blonde in the bathroom. They say that she is the ghost of a dead girl with long blonde hair. Her nose and her mouth are stuffed with bloody cotton, and blood streams from her empty eye sockets, and her skin is covered in small cuts. Some say that she appears in a mirror and stares at you, and others say that she asks you to take the cotton out of her nose. To make her appear, you must go into the last stall in the bathroom and kick the door 3 times, flush the toilet 3 times, turn a tap on and off 3 times, and say a curse word out loud 3 times. Legend has it that she was once a beautiful blonde girl who always skipped classes and hung out in the school bathroom, smoking, drinking alcohol, and generally getting up to no good. Then one day, during these escapades, she allegedly fell, hit her head on a toilet, and bled to death. Since that day, the toilets of schools are haunted by the spirit of the dead blonde. According to another legend, her name was Maria Augusta, and she was the daughter of a Brazilian viscount. At the tender age of 14, her parents forced her to marry a man that she didn't love. He was also much older than her, and she was very unhappy in the marriage. She ended up having an affair with another man, and she ran away to Europe with her lover. Unfortunately, she died of pneumonia, and her remains were shipped back to her parents. They say that at the exact moment of her death, a mirror in her parents' house shattered. Her parents put her body on display in a glass case and refused to bury her. There is yet another legend that claims the blonde in the bathroom was once a teacher who fell in love with one of her students. When her husband found out, he flew into a jealous rage and murdered her. First he stabbed her, and then he sliced her face to ribbons, and then he stuffed her head down one of the school toilets until she drowned. Here are some accounts from people who claim that they have encountered the blonde in the bathroom. It all started when this girl in my class started reading about urban legends on the internet and found the famous legend of the blonde in the bathroom. She told all of us that she was going to do the ritual. She did everything right, and she was alone in the bathroom with the door locked. Now, I don't know what happened while she was alone in there, but when she came out, she acted like nothing had happened. When we asked her if the ritual worked, she was like, "What are you guys talking about?" She couldn't remember anything about it. When one of my friends mentioned something about the blonde in the bathroom, the girl suddenly began to bang her head on the table. Her eyes turned back in her head, and she gave out a horrible screech. Her parents had to come and take her home, And when she came back to school a few days later, she said, "I don't know. I don't remember anything." Another account is as follows. When I was little, I was always fascinated by the supernatural. One day, my friend and I were in school when we heard someone screaming from the second floor. We ran up there, and what we saw was incredible. We saw many people gathered around the door of the bathroom, and just as we were going to see what was going on, we saw a student running scared and crying. There was a woman following her with a bloody nose, bloody face, and her skin was all torn up and bleeding. Most importantly, she was blonde. After a while, we saw two nuns coming, and the blonde ran into the bathroom. When the nuns opened the door, the bathroom was completely empty. The girl just disappeared, I guess. But to this very day, I can still remember her cut-up, bloody face. Well, alright everybody, and there we have it. Scary legends and scary stories from around the world. We do apologize. It does seem like many of the stories originated from within the United States of America. If you like this episode, and we end up doing another one, we will definitely search harder for scary legends and scary stories from all around the world. If you happen to be in another country where your native language is not English, and you have scary legends and scary stories that you would like to hear us read, send us an email and let us know. Alright everyone, take care of yourselves. Sweet dreams.